and we will be right back. Please stay tuned. All right, thanks everyone for joining us today. Shout out to people on Facebook, Periscope, Twitch, YouTube, and I think that's all. And thank you for joining us today. We are going to have a lively discussion, I hope, with Jackie Steele, talking about diversity issues, inclusion, all the good stuff. So thank you so much for joining us, Jackie.
Thank you, Joy, for having me.
Would you mind just briefly introducing yourself to start?
Sure. I am a Canadian originally and still today, although I've been living in Japan for a very long time. I am from a suburb of Vancouver, so West Coast Canada, and I'm a political scientist who has been basically working on diversity and citizenship issues and public policy for maybe 25 years now, comparing Japan and Canada. And I also recently began a diversity and innovation consulting firm called Enjoi. And the reason for the name is it's sort of using Japanese characters for the name Enjoi. And so the goal is to build solidarity, or goen, across the differences. And so I'm using the kanji for sai no I, which is kind of an oppositional concept of difference, but I think there's really an opportunity to build solidarity across those differences, even if we perceive them to be oppositional or uncomfortable at first. And I want it to be enjoyable. So I want it to be something that we can do in a way that's not heavy or stressful, or making us feel like we're not woke enough, we're not, educated enough. And so I'm trying to think about how do we make diversity and innovation as a conversation, and how we build that out to be something that's enjoyable. So hence the name Enjoi with an I.
Yeah, so lovely. I love that kanji. It's beautiful. I'm showing your Enjoi kanji right now. And you have that beautiful kanji, you have Enjoi with an I, and then you have diversity rocks.
Yes. Yes. And I really think, again, this is sort of a feminist philosopher queen in me. I feel like I'm a descendant of Machiavelli, but in a woman's body. And I really think that, I don't know, I guess when we think about innovation, when we think about diversity, often the first reaction people have is it rocks their worldview. They feel like, ooh, you meet somebody of a new culture and maybe it's exciting and it's curious and you're interested, but there's also an element of, I'm not so sure I agree with their worldview. I'm not so sure I'm comfortable with their, how I don't know anything about their religion, or, what do they eat and why do they eat that? And there's an element of it kind of rocks your worldviews in a negative way. But I think when you get to the point where you are really comfortable and you're confident in your own culture and your own groundedness of your identity and your sense of self and all that complexity, I think that makes you a more open-minded person who then can say, oh, I'm curious about that diversity in other people. I'm curious to know more. It doesn't threaten me. And then you can get to that point where you can say, yeah, wow, like I learned so much from other people's differences. So diversity rocks. Like it's a really exciting facet of how we grow as an individual, how we grow as a society, and how we get innovative, growth, be it, in our communities, be it in our families, in technology, in policy, in companies. If everybody was the same and you have groupthink, how do you generate innovation? How do you generate that space for growth? So from there, I'm sort of trying to develop and push this idea that diversity really rocks innovation and is a net positive.
That's wonderful. I love that. I've got a quote here from you, from your website. I'm very pleased to have seen a distinct discursive shift in the last 8 years, with increasing numbers of stakeholders attempting to take diversity more seriously. Would you agree?
Is that my quote?
That's
Did
your
I say
quote.
that?
Yeah. Is it still
Yeah,
relevant?
I do think so. So as a political scientist, I've been looking at, as I said, democratic citizenship, how we carve out room for diversity within public policies, be it the gender equality basic law, be it the multicultural conviviality framework, supporting more at the local levels in Japan, be it more recent social movement mobilizations around LGBTQ inclusion and sort of same-sex marriage movements. And of course, at the political level, there has been, I think, in that quote, I believe I was referencing that with the talk and the openness around considering gender issues and womenomics, the fact that we can talk about gender issues now as a policy issue, as an economic issue, but also as one of the challenges for democracy in Japan, that has created more space for me as an academic when I was in different roles, research roles. At first, I would say going back to 2006, my experiences were that colleagues around me, and I will delineate where I was. I was within national universities, and I think they tend to be a little bit more conservative than other university spaces, perhaps. But there was a sense that I was working on like those gender issues or those women's issues, and it was kind of seen as this like marginalized, not really pertinent to the rest of democracy or society or economics piece. And I was coming out of Canadian political science traditions around, feminist critical theory, diversity, minority nations, indigenous rights. And so all of those diversity issues are hand in hand with citizenship and democracy and all of the political philosophy and the thinking. So political science faculties and law faculties across Canada, I mean, that is the meat and potatoes of what you need to be talking about within political science. And here, when I came to the national universities in Japan, it was like, oh, that's just like a really side issue that nobody really cares about and nobody really knows about. And it must be something to do with feminism and that we're not sure that we're comfortable also engaging with. So it was hard to find a peer group within the national universities in my research in Tohoku-dai, but also later at Todai, that there was a curiosity to say, I want to talk about gender and diversity because that's so exciting and it totally intersects with democracy and citizenship and public policy, and that's so core to law and politics. Let's talk about that more. I can't say that was the reception that I got. And when you had people suddenly wanting to talk about womenomics, it was like, oh, you could talk about women, you could talk about gender, and it didn't pigeonhole you as some like radical feminist doing women's studies on the margins. You could be talking and engaging with those issues and those concepts as core concepts of political economy, which is what they are, right? Yeah. And so that's what I mean by it opened up discursive space and room for people to engage and talk about those issues and be more willing to listen. And I think
talking is the first very important step. But don't you find, and I find this all the time in terms of sustainability, that you have to have rules change, and so you have to have a minimum change due to compliance. And I know one of your books was about quotas. I know it's kind of a dirty word, but without changes from the top, change from the bottom is very difficult, not only in Japan, anywhere in the world, right?
I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the core tensions of contemporary democracy that few people maybe really accept eyes wide open is that particularly within advanced democracies or established democracies, we've achieved a level of sort of political economic stability in some senses to the point where often the population becomes a bit tuned out to their role for self-government and their role to stay vigilant in holding government accountable and asking for policy change and driving policy change and participating in social movements. And bottom-up change can happen, but it requires a unique window of opportunity for that to actually bubble into law reform that happens through Parliament. And so often what we see is protest or social movement, mobilizing, awareness raising, educating of population, changing values of the people, no correlate law reform that makes the rules of society that we're governed by actually get better. So the policy gaps grow bigger and bigger. And in Japan, I think that's been particularly challenging for the last 30 years on gender and diversity issues, is the population has become very open-minded, very accepting of difference and diversity and of gender equality and of women in paid work and of men in fathering roles. But the policy and the laws are not actually supporting and incentivizing and rewarding that behavior and encouraging companies to actively incentivize how their corporate environments work. And so, I mean, again, when I say that I'm sort of a child of Machiavelli, statecraft. I mean, there was an art to statecraft, right? When you're looking at the Roman Empire. And so statecraft was this art of how you would use law to build out liberty and freedom, both for individuals and for the whole collective society. And it really is an art. And it does require that you think through having evidence-based laws and public policies that really incentivize behavior and have compliance mechanisms, that those compliance mechanisms have teeth, that there is a responsibility to report back and show transparently that you are complying, and that there's a penalty if you don't comply. And what we've too often seen, I would say, in the last 30 years of me watching Japanese laws, there's a fairly complete absence, almost, I won't say complete, but for issues of gender and diversity, there's never a real compliance mechanism, there's never teeth, and so not surprising you don't get compliance in any meaningful way. And so the government has now pushed back the 30% targets again, to be sometime, maybe we'll achieve that between 2030 and 2050, maybe, but we might just push that back in 10 years again. We don't know, right? So that kind of, for me, that doesn't count as statecraft. Like that's a law that is rhetorical. It's a statement, but it doesn't actually have teeth. And if you can imagine, if we had a police force and our criminal justice system, and we said, well, we're just going to trust citizens not to steal, because, well, or if they do steal, we'll ask them why they stole, and we'll ask them to tell us why they stole, and that'll be enough to discourage future repeat behavior. So we don't really need to invest in a police force. We don't need to have a criminal justice system. We don't need to build out all of that institutional, knowledge and practice around accountability on those issues and having compliance. We would never do that for crime. We would never do that for really matters that are taken seriously. So I find it challenging that, gender and diversity issues are still not taken serious enough so as to require a meaningful mechanism that actually has legal compliance mechanisms with teeth. And I think that's the next step for the Reiwa era. Frankly, that's the next 50 years of building Reiwa democracy and institutional build-outs of these core commitments.
Or even, something that we often look for as consumers of ethical, sustainable companies is we check how they're actually behaving, not just what they say. And we see that with government policy when they make this great policy, but they themselves do not fill their cabinet with more than one out of all men panels or manels, as Melanie Brock often likes to say, right?
Yes.
So
it's true that
you have to walk the walk.
Exactly, and it's having the courage of your convictions. And I realize that having studied Japanese politics and Canadian politics and looking at how do you get compliance, but I guess the really tricky part of modern democracies is the individuals who are passing these laws would be the same people as the political parties who are affected by re-election. And so if all of a sudden the government of the day adopted really a strong law, they first have to have their own parliamentary caucus agree with it. But their own parliamentary caucus is like 90% or more men. So for those men to say, yeah, we want more women, we're willing to have diversity of ideas and competition of ideas, and let's bring in a whole plethora of different worldviews into our party and into the candidates who run for those men potentially will not keep their seats. So there's a direct conflict of interest that they are passing a law that curtails their own self-interest. And I think that is one of the weaknesses right now of how we get massive shift, because you're asking the government of the day to say they're not going to think about their own private self-interest as parliamentarians. They're not going to think about their own political partisan success. They're actually going to think and act for what is the best interest of the country and of democracy in Japan by ensuring a robust competition of ideas really comes into the diet by trying to really incentivize political parties to change their recruitment away from the usual suspects. And without incentive, the usual suspects are still being chosen by the most competitive parties in Japan. And so the LDP, I've just finished publishing an article about this, and literally, unfortunately, the LDP and the coalition party Komeito in the most recent elections were the ones who didn't do due diligence. They didn't comply with the gender parity law that was just adopted. And they didn't really double down and change at all the gender balance in their candidates. So they had passed a law, and then they said, we're above the law. We're just going to go with our usual suspects because we don't want to disappoint the men in our caucus. Well, they think we owe them. Those men think that they're owed a seat. They're owed support and loyalty back, and we're going to go with that rather than the broader legal, requirement that they've just literally adopted. And you sort of think, well, then why do you think you're above the law? Why is it that we're supposed to have in a democracy the rule of law, not the rule of man?
Well, quite often the excuse that you will hear is there's not enough qualified women to fill those slots. And I think the most excellent quote I heard from that is in Sweden, when they decided to have 50% representation in government. All of a sudden, they had a deadline. They knew it was coming, they somehow found the women. But even in their country, which is more progressive, they still had people saying, "You're not going to find qualified people," but they did.
Well, and it's true, and I think there's a point at which we need to just no longer accept that is a smokescreen, right? That's a distraction campaign to say that somehow there's a lack of talent in the 50% of the population that are women, and it's a particularly 50%. It's a particularly misogynist view that I think needs to be called out, and we need to stop repeating it, because we know that, frankly, the research so I've spent a lot of my time in the international politics and gender and diversity political science networks and legal networks. And the research really does actually show that when you have gender quotas come in, and for example, the research out of Sweden in particular really empirically shows that all of a sudden you had stronger competition for all seats, because all of a sudden you had sort of an obligation to bring in way more women, and women who generally, if you look at the research on Canada, for example, out of even 20 years ago, to be selected as a candidate and to be a woman means generally you're kind of a superwoman to get in. You tend to you're overqualified because you're trying to get through the barriers and the bias and the gatekeeping that happens. And so in order to get through those gatekeeping channels, you actually are quite overqualified, and on straight credentials, when different researchers have done straight credentials matching on women and men candidates in Canada and Sweden, you see different caliber of credentials amongst the women more so than the men. So in terms of just baseline measurables, women often are super candidates to get in, just to get through the door. So the fact that women tend to be less qualified is just not substantively upheld. And it basically points to this idea that none of the men who get in by nepotism, that none of the men who have ever gotten elected have been mediocre, that none of the men who have gotten elected weren't deserving. And yet we know that that's not always true of the male candidates who've been populating our parliaments for however many years that we've had a modern democracy. So yeah, absolutely. When there is an actual mechanism with teeth, the political parties finally say, okay, now we actually have to go out of our usual suspects, and we need to now try to reach out to find professional women's networks and invest in building trust with those networks. And we need to get to know the women, and we need to find women who think according to our party line. We need to find out and build solidarity with a whole other affinity group that we've been happy to just not have to deal with because it's more work. And that's not just on gender, that's on, it could be on multiculturalism, that, we don't make enough efforts to broaden and diversify and build relations of trust to multicultural communities and professionals from multicultural backgrounds, from professionals with disabilities, that we don't build trust with those demographics either. We don't do our due diligence, in terms of actually broadening our political parties to recruit the diversity of talent and gifts that are actually spread out across all social groups, of course, because we're lazy. And so at some point, there's no qualified women. That's just a lazy answer. And so from my perspective, I've heard it for 30 years. It's the lazy answer. It's that I'm not willing to do the work to actually go out of my comfort zone because I'm not quite confident enough to embrace the difference of other types of groups. And so I think it reflects a lack of confidence on that elite group that's saying, you know what, it's just easier for us to stay in our own little group think.
Yeah.
It's just easier.
And I think something you said maybe before we started today was that people think of it as something not related to me. Like when you're teaching gender studies or when you're consulting about diversity, until there's a reason that they have to do it, or it's compliance coming from the top, they really feel like it's not related to them. But if they do adopt more inclusion, diversity policies, it actually helps everyone. And I think this is one of the things that often comes up in your work. It helps men as caregivers. It helps, take care of elderly in our country.
Well, and absolutely I think, irony and also kind of the travesty of this conversation and what I've seen for this 30 years of a policy gap, if you wanted to solve the crisis of declining birth rates, aging society, shrinking regions, overpopulation in cities, childcare, elder care, women who are burnt out because they are now expected to have more than one child, raise those children largely alone at home if a spouse can't get out of long working FaceTime hours at the company. They also are supposed to be doing the elder care. They're supposed to be doing the PTA role. They're supposed to be doing the community networking, and they're supposed to be keeping everybody fed and happy and making the meals. And there are only so many hours in the day. And so the fact that women have made this rational choice over time, over the last 30 to 40 years, to have fewer children because they're basically single parents and they're burnt out, and society is not having their back. The infrastructure is not there, and the family structure is pulled in two directions, with companies demanding really long working FaceTime hours of the men and of women who are in those career track roles. So who's left to look after children and to caregive the elderly? And so if you can't understand and bring evidence-based knowledge to gender and diversity issues, we're not solving any of those public policy and political economy crisis issues for Japan in the next 20 years. And so these issues do absolutely offer keys to policy innovation on how Japanese democratic institutions and policy supports could be helping families, helping companies reframe childcare and children not as a dead weight on productivity, right? That weighs down, and that if their workers have children, that means more work for everybody else when they take maternity leave or paternity leave. And so now you sort of make all of the new parents feel bad about the fact that they're having a newborn baby. Well, what a shame that we can't celebrate and be supportive of new parents, both women and men, and say, every company, I would love to have the president, and I think it was, the president of Marui, I think it was said, it walks up to their employees, and if they know they're expecting a child, man or woman, says, congratulations, when are you taking your paternity leave, maternity leave? And it's a when are you taking it? It's not are you taking it, it's a when are you taking it? Because now this is a pivotal thing that you need to go spend time on to be an ethical father or to be an ethical parent and caregiver. So companies allowing men to have that permission to be empowered fathers, that we're not making it detract from their masculinity to show up as caregivers for their newborns. Because if we can't solve fathering in Japan, then why would we expect women to continue to want to have children with absentee co-parents? It's a lose-lose, right? It's a lose for the women, it's a lose for the men, it's a lose for the children, and it's a lose for society. And so we're in this crunch now that we haven't solved. So I do hope that bringing in more women, more diverse men into elected office, men who have caregiving experience, men who've done elder care, who can enrich that conversation around how the policy needs to be evolved. So all of those diverse caregiving women and men is who we really need in the diet right now. And we need those individuals also in companies in position of leadership, and changing the corporate policies to be supportive of caregiving needs. Because the other interesting piece that I've been able to connect the dots on, when I'll take off my political scientist hat and put on my Enjoi consulting hat, some beautiful research from one of my thought partners in Toronto. His name is Steele, and he's written an amazingly well-researched volume on EQ leadership, emotionally intelligent leadership, and what are the qualities of an EQ leader. And in this book, he really connects the dots on, particularly for the future of work and for senior leadership roles, we need emotional intelligence. We need strong communication, interpersonal skills and communication skills. We need a sense of ability to self-regulate our own emotions and understand our own emotions to be able to be empathetic with others. And we need to be able to be bridging with others for senior leadership, critical thinking skills, and EQ leadership. So if we deprive, in Japanese companies, parents from this critical time and training grounds to spend time with their newborns, to spend time with their 2-year-olds who are barely verbal, and you still have to try and communicate and build empathy with them, with a 3-year-old that's having a temper tantrum in the supermarket, that you can't just pull out your business card and say, I pull rank. I'm making you get in the car now. I pull rank. I have a business card that says I'm a bucho, so fall in line, right? You can't do that with a temper tantrum, to 3-year-old. You need to have influential skills on communication to get collaboration with that 3-year-old. And here, there's so much training that goes on in relationship building within families that is a training ground for senior leadership and emotionally intelligent leadership that we're not honoring in companies enough, and then allowing employees and all the way to managers, to top managers, to see that as a golden opportunity to develop skills, transferable skills that are critical for the future of work and innovation, that then they bring back to the company after they come back from their 6-month or 1-year paternity leave. We need that investment, and we need that investment 20 years ago in men.
Yeah.
And I don't see that happening yet, but it's kind of unfolding slowly.
That's good to
but
hear.
I see that as such a huge window of building solidarity across difference, because we need, first and foremost, that kind of emotional intelligent leadership competencies.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is a kind of barrier to innovation in Japan, I've seen it, and I'm sure it exists in other places, is the idea that I heard many times that anybody should be able to do anything. That's why a lot of government offices or big businesses will just shift people around, irregardless of their experience or their expertise, and just expect anyone to do any job. And I think that's the whole nail the hammer down, or whatever idiom you want to use. But it takes away people's differences as well, right? And it takes away the value of experience and the value of diversity. And that's one of the things, working in a company for a long time, I found especially hard to put up with, because especially that new shift at the beginning of the year, and you're like, but they know how to do that. Let's keep them there,
I think there's different values to that approach to human resource mobilization. I think that we get different value addeds from different strategies. And I guess I would love to see a diversity of tactics being used within Japanese companies and all companies, really. Because I think the value of saying, what is your competitive edge? What are your individual strengths? Know thyself, right? What are your strengths as an individual? What does your creativity bring that is unique to your gifts and your experiential background and training and education? Let's harness that for innovation and for productivity. But I think the idea that you could, yes, develop those skills and have your individual performance be really valued, and so that you can develop that expertise and become a sort of more authoritative speaker on those issues within your company, that's certainly one really important piece, I think, of productivity. But my understanding is that the rotation gives you a different view of different parts of the company that you then can see from a different bird's eye view. It opens up blind spots that you weren't aware of when you were in your role within a given team. So in some ways, it can also help cross-functionality so that you are more people as they have breadth across multiple roles, they can see how their role intersects with other parts of the business. I think those are win-wins, but if they are one at the expense of the other, I guess I would tend to agree with you that it would be counterproductive. So balancing that, investing in that expertise and the individual competitive edge. And frankly, when you're doing something that you enjoy and that you love, you show up at work with such energy and commitment, and because it's enjoyable and it's fun and you like your teammates and you feel a sense of self-worth and you feel recognized and seen for what are your unique talents and gifts. That's just a net win for the individual and for the company. So being, shoved into a role every 4 years and that you really don't enjoy it, and it's a constant treasury of learning curve just for the sake of, this is the way things have always been done. I'm on rotation every 3 to 4 years. I think that needs some critical thinking. I think it needs more of a revisiting and thinking about, okay, what is the talent loss that comes from that if it's premature?
And if there's is there a follow-up? Is there communication after?
Exactly.
Like, does that value of moving around and learning everything, does it lead to something better? Does it lead to a management role?
Right. And the thing is, and we still see, so often, not only for Japanese bureaucracy and government, but also in corporations, you hear that people are in silos. That it tends to be that departments and subunits are very much still in silos. So again, that begs the question: to what extent is it helping multi-function, cross-functional team building and keeping a broader perspective on your role in light of what other teams are doing, or are people still in silos? Because if it's not breaking down the silos, maybe it's really not necessarily performing the role that initially it was perceived to have. And so I think it's in some ways, when do you revisit the system? When do you say, well, the system is high performing in this area and this area, we like what it's doing here, unintended consequences for A, B, and C that are now a net drain on innovation and a net drain on talent, and so talent gets demoralized and quits and jumps ship to another company.
That brings me so squarely into my next point I wanted to talk about. In your most recent webinar that you did, really interesting talk, available on YouTube, you were talking about how in consulting with companies or businesses or organizations, one of the key points is that understanding diversity, making diversity and inclusion work is a practice.
Yes.
Right? Like, it's something you have to revisit and reanalyze and make new goals. And this is so key for anything with sustainability, for the environment or society or people. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and I guess the reason why I keep harping on this, I talk about resilience as a practice as well, and diversity as a praxis or a practice, because I think we see so much rhetorical statement. We see these grand affirmations and, well, our corporate philosophy says this, that, and the other, and therefore we support more women on boards, and our vision is that we should have more gender balance within our managers and senior managers, and it says so, and our company president said so. and abracadabra, ta-da! Like there's this kind of sense that it will just happen automatically without any effort or building of systems or building of institutions or building of mechanisms and building of metrics, and then finding the data and then tracking the data, reporting on the data, and then seeing if it's working. And if the data is not generating the results that it's supposed to be, then you need to go back and revisit the initial policy and the mechanisms and the metrics. And that is an ongoing, I mean, that is basically the homework of democracy when we're talking about public policy. That is a never-ending democratic homework. Well, within corporations, that is a never-ending challenge for the D&I business strategy, is to keep looking at those policies and analyzing them with a diversity lens. And I must say, most companies, I don't think they've ever done a diversity analysis. I don't think they've said, I'm going to bring up every single, and this is one of the services that I offer. It's called a policy ecosystem audit. Let's pull out all of the human resource policies, your hiring processes, your talent promotions mechanisms, all of the different ways and the rules, informal and formal, by which everyone in the company functions. Let's lay out what are all those decision rules. And what are they incentivizing? And then let's take a diversity lens to that. And let's see what are the intended consequences of those decision rules and those practices on the books. What are the really toxic, negative, unintended consequences that you're not even aware of? And then once you've done your sort of audit, then you have a sense, okay, well, how are HR hiring, how are policies? Do we acknowledge same-sex partners in our company? Do we allow a same-sex partner to be a recipient of healthcare benefits? The law in Japan does not allow for same-sex marriage. Corporations, and in other countries, corporations did decide to be first movers and to say, well, we can be more generous. We can expand, health benefits to recognize a same-sex spouse. And so how can corporate policy leadership help provide a stopgap in between mechanism to help companies recruit global talent, retain global talent, recruit and retain diverse talent from around the world, even if there is still a lag time on the actual laws around, same-sex marriage or whatever is the case. A lot of companies don't have paid paternity leave. Well, companies, there is a really generous, national legal system that gives paternity leave that men don't use. Well, what if it was a system where companies said, yes, we want you to use it, and we want you to use it to the extent that we're even going to give you a top-up bonus if you use it. We will incentivize you to use it and go use your paternity leave. So it'll be on predominantly, the public coffers, taxpayer dollar, but the companies really want to shift in their culture and send signals from the senior leadership level to say, please, we value caregiving. We value that we need to support parents. So we're going to give an extra bonus.
And those rules have got to apply to senior management too.
Senior manager must not only be the ones who walk the talk and they lead, and often they're beyond childbearing age, so that can be challenging, but they also can be held accountable in a different way, whereby you give them a bonus and a performance bonus based on how many of their childbearing generation of parents, men and women, but men in particular, use parental leave. So they can be incentivized to really go out and preach to the men in their company to say, no, really, I want you to go take parental leave. I think it's important. And I will get a bonus if you also take this seriously, that it's something our company culture wants to build out as a point of pride, because then we stand out. And if we stand out on this, young men will want to come work for us. And if young men and women want to come work for us, that drives our talent pipeline. More young new hires, the millennials, will want to come because we really take this seriously. And so the new younger generations are going to go, wow, can you build your brand around something better than encouraging parents to take leave and encouraging both mothers and fathers to get a bonus for taking their legally rightful paternity and maternity leaves and not being taxed for it, not having bullying for it, not being made to feel bad about that. being
How
celebrated.
how do you think the coronavirus and working from home has helped with flexibility at the workplace? Has it made it better? Because you hear both sides. You hear some people saying it's great because I can more easily balance taking care of my elderly parents or taking care of my kids, because I don't have that commute time. But then on the other hand, you hear people saying, I just don't know when to stop working. I'm working all the time, you know?
Yes. Well, so if we go back to EQ leadership and the EQ leader in Stephen Stein's book, self-regulation and self-management, how to do self-care? How do we manage our workload and our stress? Do we even recognize what the signals are around our own lack of well-being? And I think for most people who are in Japanese corporations that demand, the 12 to 16-hour day, they've been asked to ignore their body's signals. They've been asked to count FaceTime hours as productivity when FaceTime hours does not generate productivity. And so I think one thing that COVID-19 has forced upon everybody in a very sort of equalizing fashion. Now, let's face it, women who are full-time caregivers do this every single day because they are managing themselves, their households, their children, and their well-being, and they're managing how to plan out energy levels throughout the day. This is a core skill of parenting, and particularly if you're a full-time parent. The hardest job I've ever had to do was full-time caregiving of a child, a young child, because you have to really manage your own self-care in an active way, right? To be able to show up as a leader for that child. And so maybe COVID-19 is inviting every single individual to go home and take some critical distance from being at the office and waiting for a superior to tell them what to do with their time or tell them which meeting they need to be in. They need to figure out how they're managing their time. What are they working on? Who do they report back to? How do they put, a stop and start to those working hours? And I think at a minimum, it's made caregiving visible to everybody because now everybody is at home seeing the caregiving and how much work that is. I don't know that changes the division of labor of that caregiving, but it might at least make that caregiving for the very first time visible to a lot of men who've been completely absent from seeing it or witnessing the extent of what that workload looks like in terms of an emotional load, a mental load, and a physical load. And hopefully they've decided to take a more active role and maybe they're sharing more in that load with their other partner. I can hope that that's the case. And for partners who are already showing up and participating actively in caregiving, I think there's a gain in their own time, not having to work with commute, to be able to not worry about, lunchtime hour. I mean, lunchtime is kind of an interesting one because you sort of stop, you make lunch for children who are being technically homeschooled, maybe under your care while you're concurrently working, which I think is unrealistic, but we've expected that of parents for almost 4 months. But homeschooling children while you're working full time, honestly, is probably one of the biggest flops, I think, and the biggest takeaways that as governments and as companies need to really take seriously. You can't expect your employees to show up with 100% of their productivity when they've got children that they're homeschooling concurrently underfoot. And expecting that that's just going to be dealt with by mothers, which I think has been a big assumption. And so structures haven't really been put in place sufficiently. And had there been a diversity lens brought to COVID-19 by the Prime Minister, by the cabinet, by parliamentarians, by corporate presidents, to say, okay, we need a diversity lens on this. What are the implications for our parents? What are the implications for productivity? What are the implications for women more than men? What are the implications for people who have elderly parents, who are single children? If there had been a diversity lens, brought to the fore in February, because they had in-house capacity of their staff and of their senior leaders who understood how to build out a diversity lens, they could have made so many better decisions in how you build out supports for the full diversity of the workforce during this very, very, very difficult time of a global pandemic. I maintain there's maybe a silver lining that hopefully, at a minimum, Japanese companies have had to go remote work in a very, very quick amount of time, at least the major companies, particularly in the urban centers where you have such high population density. Maybe not so much in rural Nagano where I am now, but for really the major headquarters of the major companies, they finally had to really just commit to remote work, even though they, for kicking and screaming, a lot of them didn't want to do remote work and have pushed back against remote work. And Silicon Valley does that. And we want to be like Silicon Valley, but we don't really want remote work yet because we don't know what that means. And we're not comfortable without long FaceTime hours. That's our productivity measure. Now it's forced a full-fledged investment in building out a praxis of working from home. So now you have practices of working from home. And now it's a practice. Maybe you can then build out that practice and accommodate more caregiving practices into that, acknowledgement of how that interrupts, the work day. Will it stick? I'm not sure. I'm hoping it'll stick more. But for now, we're still in COVID-19 for, I think, several more months, if not longer. So who knows what 2021 will hold. But I think the longer we're forced to practice building out teamwork at home, because let's face it, families have been put under tremendous pressure to build on their teamwork, to develop EQ leadership, to be empathetic with one another, to support each other, to have each other's backs. And the families that are not making that work, are not able to have that kind of solidarity together, this is a really stressful time to be trapped at home together. So it can go in both ways, right?
Yeah, for sure. Let's hope it continues to be reassessed and revised and improved, because this is going to be a much longer process than anybody anticipated, right? So it's not too late for someone to hire a consultant like you and get diversity lens in and start making improvements.
Absolutely, and the first movers will get the best talent wanting to come work for them. So I think it's such a huge investment in your competitive edge and for your also innovation in the future, to be sustainably innovative. You just need that influx of new worldviews and ideas that I think can come with a diversification of talent.
Yeah. Now we've got 15 minutes left. I want to be able to talk about all your exciting events that you're a part of with your webinars and everything. Let's talk about your upcoming events first. Okay. So you have, let's see, Impact Games.
Yes, well, so there's, of course, we thought that the Olympics would have been held, the 2020 Olympics, and there's a very interesting project called the Global Summit, and it was spearheaded and is spearheaded by Melanie St. James, and it's a big global conversation that has been moving from country to country every 2 years, held in a different country, and mobilizing sort of global conversations about gender equal partnerships, about building out innovation that is sustainable, about building out technology that works for humanity, about learning for life, about all of these different impact areas, and that really speak to the Sustainable Development Goals, frankly. And so for the Global Summit that is happening from August, the Leaders Forum is from August 11th to 13th. It's billed out as not the Olympic Games, but the Impact Games, the Social Impact Games. And that's where we bring these cross-sectoral conversations with global leaders from around the world tuning in to the first ever online Global Summit. And it's basically a huge global online conversation that is going to provoke a sharing of ideas, expertise across sectors, and thinking about what are the initiatives that can have impact for humanity and for the planet in very positive ways. And so I've been involved to help build diversity of speakers and into the sort of thinking about how the program works throughout the 3 days of the Leaders Forum for the main stage, and trying to bring an intersectional diversity to think about, okay, we don't want to just think about gender balance, we want to think about, global balance, so different continents and different ethnocultural backgrounds and different language groups and different sexual orientations and different, expertise and professional views and insights and research communities as well as practitioner communities. So building out that diversity. across the speakers. And the one main panel that I'm hosting is called The Dawn of Diversity. And we're looking at sort of thinking forward about what are the tensions between building out not only diversity and respect for diversity within the human family. And I have speakers, 4 of whom are from Japan, but of very diverse backgrounds. So you'll see a lot of non-traditional understandings and practices of Japanese-ness on that panel. Both some individuals who bring hybrid identities, half Japanese, half something else in terms of multicultural, different sexuality and gender expressions, different physical abilities, but everyone bringing a unique perspective and insight about why living in Japan is exciting and what is diversity in Japan look like. So that's an exciting panel, and it's attempting to sort of build the first stages of how we think outside the box and redefine what could Reiwa diversity look like for Japan, but also how do we think about that across different countries. So we also have someone joining us from Canada, from Vancouver, who brings a really unique perspective on diverse masculinities. And is really cutting edge in terms of driving conversations in the United States and Canada around gender and masculinity. So from a men's perspective too. I guess the summit is exciting. It's bringing both art and music with the Artists Unite concert, which is a global concert that will go around the globe with all different types of artists. The Leaders Forum, bringing leaders together to have these provocative conversations, to think forward and be innovative together. And then we have Catalyst training and picking up leaders who have ideas and solutions for social impact that they want to workshop forward and be supported in rolling forward with global mentor support. So it's an exciting project. My first time being involved, but it's really an exciting way to think about how building out a diversity lens for the programming elements is something I think I'm thinking about more in terms of how Enjoi D&I within Japan, but other conferences, how can I bring that diversity lens to companies that want to build out really cutting edge events that challenge stereotypes, that really challenge stereotypes, that rather having the usual suspects and the usual talking heads, let's be edgy. Let's have, views and talking heads that sort of make you go, oh, I didn't know that person was Japanese, or wow, that person has phenomenal, insight on something that, that's really interesting to see coming from somebody who's from XYZ background. Things that really make you think and that stays with you after you go home after the event. Those kinds of talking heads, I think, are what bring change and bring change agency. So I would love to work with companies on helping them field and think about that piece of their corporate events.
Nice. You were also part of Move the Dial?
Yes, and Move the Dial is a really exciting conference held in Toronto. Mm-hmm. And it was held last November in Toronto, and it basically is brought together the whole tech sector for North America. So all of the major tech companies came together for Move the Dial, and it was really to think about how do we build out greater diversity in the tech sector for North America. And I was there bringing insights from the Japanese diversity and inclusion conversations from what I'm seeing in Japan, the challenges within tech. I had previously organized a panel for FEW Japan for our International Women's Day event in 2019, I guess, and it was diversifying tech. So we had brought together some interesting CEOs in tech in Japan for a conversation for our FEW Japan event. And so I brought those insights forward and then had, through that lens, learned about all of the different actors in the tech sector in Japan and the interesting things they were tackling. And that also then resulted in a second Canadian Embassy event that was organized, FEW Japan plus the Canadian Embassy, that was also building out innovation through diversity. And that was just this past February, if you can imagine, right before things started to really take off for COVID-19. And so one of the last in-person events, actually, that I had the pleasure of curating and then attending and participating in. And I think one of the things with the Canadian Embassy that was so unique is we had, trade section, political section, public affairs, all 3 teams worked together on the Canadian Embassy side with the FEW Japan board. And I was able to tap a lot of the Enjoi diversity and inclusion thought partners in my network. We're about 80 people now in my network for Enjoi, and that brings such diverse insights and perspectives. And with that team, we put on an event that sold out the Canadian Embassy Theatre. So we had like 150 people signing up, and then we had a live feed that was, watched and followed. And so the breadth of that impact, I think, was really interesting to see when you have really cross-sectoral collaboration. And the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, of course, I serve as the governor. So the Canadian Chamber of Commerce also came out and supported that event. So FEW Japan is a professional women's organization bringing a diversity of professional women combined with, the Canadian Chamber diplomatic power and the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and the Canadian Embassy, sorry, I should say. So just, unusual partnerships, but that really, get the audiences to be so much broader and diverse.
Wow, interesting. And another one I hadn't heard of before, Mashing Up, a Japanese one?
Yes, Mashing Up is a really excellent conference. It's been held for several years now. I was there invited to speak on the panel dealing with leadership and how to diversify leadership. So Nakamura-san hosts that conference and curates it, and it's one of the few all Japanese language, very modern and edgy and provocative conferences that I've been able to attend and that I loved. Her vision is really exciting, and it was just so refreshing to really see literally, 2 days of rooms just teeming with Japanese nationals who are excited and interested in diversity and in gender equality. So often it's a multinational space, and it's an expat space, and it's predominantly those usual suspects that we get out to a lot of the diversity inclusion conversations. But that conference, Mashing Up, definitely recommend it to Japanese speakers who are interested in the diversity conversation. It's a really, really just funky and edgy and fun conference with really good speakers and unusual talking heads. That was such a breath of fresh air, I would say.
Wow, wonderful. And of course, you've got a lot more webinars and online things going on. What's the best place for people to contact you and find out more?
Sure. People can reach me through LinkedIn. I have a profile there, but even more so, I would encourage them to check out my website. So www.en-joi.com. And I would also encourage you to take a look at the thought partners that you can see on my website. There's, like I said, 80 exceptionally interesting professionals and experts from different ages and backgrounds and nationalities and language groups from around APAC. I've recruited across APAC, and you'll notice there's about 75% women, 25% men, and that was intentional to amplify women's thought leadership. If you're wondering where to find all the qualified women, maybe you can check out the Enjoi Thought Partners. There's a lot of really interesting women on that space, and so I hope we can debunk this myth that there's no qualified women out there. I know tons and tons of fabulously qualified and interestingly non-traditional men as well in this network who show up for gender equality, who show up for women's thought leadership, and who show up for diversity. And so those individuals, I think, bring, I'm hoping that this thought partner network builds a sense of soft power, that there's a lot of us out there who think these are just democratic values that should be taken for granted, and let's move the dial. Let's just implement now. Let's stop talking about it. We don't need to convince any more about why this matters for innovation or for well-being. We just now need to get on with implementing and moving the dial to developing those practices that work, and then tracking it and being accountable to ourselves and to others. So I think we can do that. And if we can do that, diversity will rock innovation in Japan.
That's awesome. That's a great way to leave it. Just make sure you're talking about it, you're making aims for it, you're assessing what's going on, and you're reassessing and trying to fix on a regular basis.
With data, with actual metrics.
Yeah. And really listening and good communication. All the key values of anything sustainable, for sure.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That is our hour.
It's been a pleasure.
That was so wonderful. There's so many more things we could talk to you about. You have such a wealth and variety of knowledge that I would love to tap into. So please join us again in a few months. We'll talk about something else.
I would absolutely love to. This has been a pleasure, Joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And tomorrow morning from 7:15, I will be doing a tribute to Hiroshima because it's Hiroshima 75 tomorrow morning. So please join us on Friday from 8:30 in the morning. We have Clementine from Mikan Bags, and she will be talking about an exciting new product we're collaborating on. So please join us. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.